Hi everyone. In this lecture, I'll be providing you with a brief overview of some evidence-based programs. These are programs that follow manualized approaches that have empirical evidence supporting their use and efficacy for the mental health issue they were developed for. Having this information will be helpful as you encounter these approaches during your own search of the research for your paper for this class. We'll start with MAP, Managing and Adapting Practice. MAP provides a framework for accessing research and resources and then translating them into tangible interventions or strategies for use in therapy. According to their website, they help practitioners to identify and select best fitting evidence-based treatments by providing a collection of information resources, detailed guides, and decision and process models to help guide decisions about what practices to use when, how to know that they're being done with integrity, and how to know whether they're achieving the desired outcomes. It basically takes what you do when you search the research databases at MSMU to find the best interventions in the research databases. And it's going to streamline the process. So instead of you having to go in and looking in EBSCOhost or PsycInfo and putting in your search terms, you can use their system to do it for you. And it's supposed to make it a little faster. It also will offer you then practitioner guides to facilitate service delivery and clinical dashboards to monitor progress. I'm going to go over each of these sections in more detail next. All right, so first is the PracticeWise Evidence-Based Services, or PWEBS, database. This provides a research database that gives you summaries of research studies and research-informed tools, which they call protocols, to guide treatment. Basically, like you would go onto the library research databases for this class, you'll go onto PWEBS and you'll enter the child's age, gender, ethnicity, and predominant problem, and it will produce results for you. And this will include both summaries of research and then actual protocols, which we'll get into later, that give you strategies for structuring sessions, interventions, and worksheets. What I found most helpful about this is that it ranked the interventions or approaches based on the strength of the empirical evidence, which is not something we get from a traditional research database. And so you can see an example at the bottom here where it's ranked from level 1 to 5, with 1 being the best support for this particular issue are these interventions that are listed. And then you can use the protocols that are indicated there. So for example, for best support, we see attention training for anxious or avoidant behaviors. So you could then access the attention training protocol, which again, I'll get to in a minute. The unfortunate thing about this is you can't access PWEBS, which is provided through PracticeWise, without paying to be trained and then paying an annual fee for PWEBS. So that's a bit of a bummer. Like, I've been trained in MAP, but since I'm no longer paying for PWEBS, I can't access this anymore. All right, practitioner guides are broken into 2 different types: practice guides and process guides. Process guides are going to give you logic models for organizing key aspects of service delivery. So the one on the left here, for example, is a process guide. And this one offers some problem-solving suggestions for when you run into issues in therapy. Practice guides are 2-page guides that provide you with common procedures or interventions in evidence-based practice for a given issue. For example, behavioral management or token economy. Oh, I thought I had one here. Let me pause and I'm going to show you one that is for commands or giving effective instructions. So let me hang on for me a second. Okay, so this is the practice guide for commands or effective instructions. And all of the practice guides are going to be structured fairly similarly. It'll give you some objectives of what you're trying to accomplish with this particular guide, and then steps of what to do in therapy. So here you have the steps listed here: provide rationale for it, set the stage, give some examples, and so on and so on. And then follow up at the end, okay? And then they also give you some tips. So these would be practice guides and would be what you're going to be pulling from PWEBS. So it's going to list which practice guides you should be using that have the most evidence for that particular issue with that particular client. So I'm going to return to the slides here. Okay, so those are practitioner guides, also called protocols, in case that was confusing. Okay, then you have the clinical dashboard. So the clinical dashboard is basically an Excel spreadsheet template where you track progress and use of different tools. So at the beginning of MAP, you're going to administer a battery of assessments, and then you'd use them throughout therapy. And the results of those assessments are then graphed into the dashboard to provide you a visual representation of the client's progress. So for example, if you gave them the PHQ-9, where were they at the first session, then at the second and the third, and you want to see that the symptoms are improving. Beneath this tracking piece of the dashboard, there will be a list of specific protocols or interventions that you focused on in the session so that you can see which interventions or practice guides, for example, appear to have had the most impact. The dashboard is something that you can create on your own to track progress and to help your client visualize. If you don't have access to the MAP version, it's actually not too difficult to create. And you can also customize it to make it more personal to your client by adding images, changing colors, and so on. So this is a sample one for you. And you can see up at the top is the tracking of the assessment scores. You can see kind of how it's changing. This is for the PHQ-9 and the RCADs. And then at the bottom, with that list of all of those different interventions, is where you would indicate what you did in the session with the little dots. And so then you can see how those interventions affected or didn't the scoring on the assessments. All right, so that's MAP. We're going to move on to ART, aggression replacement training. This is an intervention that was designed for treating aggression in youth and has been adapted for use with children. It has 3 components that align nicely with the CBT approach, so you can use some of this and integrate it into your CBT even if you aren't formally trained in all things ART. So these components are social skills training, anger control, and moral reasoning. And like most other evidence-based programs, ART includes a battery of assessments that are administered pre and post-treatment. So first is social skills training, and this teaches clients what to do to replace negative behaviors with positive ones. This is done by teaching them a pro-social skill, such as asking for help, modeling use of the skill, having the child role play the skill, providing feedback, and exploring ways to use the skill outside of session. This is a helpful model that capitalizes on social learning theory and operant conditioning. This makes this particular program especially useful in a group setting where it was designed to be held, where clients can observe others role play and provide feedback for each other and receive feedback from peers. Next is anger control, which teaches clients how to control their anger and identify what not to do when angry. Remember, the point is not that anger is bad, but that anger should be responded to appropriately. And in order to do this, clients are taught to identify their triggers and body cues for anger first. For example, clenched fists, maybe. Then it offers strategies for managing anger, including using self-statements like, I am calm, and using reducers such as counting to 10 or taking a deep breath. Then the program facilitates reflection by prompting clients to use self-evaluation to reflect on whether they handled a situation appropriately and what can be improved on in the future. One tool from the anger control section that I found especially helpful was the ABC triangle. I don't know if that's what they call it, but that's what I call it, of anger. And so you can see that here, antecedent behavior consequence, to help the child to understand how each of these are connected and how they can be interrupted at either point, probably except for the consequence. Okay. The last component is moral reasoning, and this helps to raise a client's understanding and investment in fairness, justice, and concern for others. It's done by presenting a vignette of a moral dilemma and then asking questions about it and having a discussion. And so they provide you with a whole bunch of vignettes, and you would then read them aloud or have the children act them out and then process them. Okay. And you could theoretically look through the vignettes to find out which one is most appropriate for what your clients are dealing with at the moment. Next, we have dialectical behavior therapy. And this was developed initially for treatment of borderline personality disorder. And full DBT does require extensive training. So many practitioners choose to do what is called DBT-informed treatment. And this involves including only one or some modes of DBT. If you are wanting to get fully trained, you can do that at behavioraltech.org. It's a 10-day intensive course, and then it requires basically that gives you your 40 hours of training, and then it requires a certification exam and a a submission of a case conceptualization with 3 taped sessions. So it's pretty intense. But that doesn't mean that you can't use some stuff from DBT to do that DBT informed treatment. And a lot of the resources are available online for you. Before I go into the 4 components here, the basic principles of DBT are to create a life worth living for clients. That's what this is here. And believing that clients can improve by learning how to get their needs met through more functional and adaptive means. There are 4 components or modes. Skills training is the first and is typically done in a group format weekly for 2 to 2.5 hours. The first hour is homework and review. The second hour is skill building. And then the groups are going to last typically 5 to 7 weeks per module. They can be done in open or closed groups. And ideally, your groups would complete 2 6-month cycles of skills training. The skills training component is the most common since it's the least expensive, and it uses handouts like the one you see on the left here. The focus is on the client learning new skills, enhancing their capabilities, and generalizing skills to other aspects of their lives. There are 4 separate skills modules, which you can see here: mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. With mindfulness, the clients are learning how to observe and be aware of their interactions. Okay. With emotion regulation, you might be doing things like an emotion diary or figuring out how to change unwanted emotions. With distress tolerance, you're learning skills like paired muscle relaxation and self-soothing. And then with interpersonal effectiveness, you're learning about how to clarify your priorities, which is the worksheet you see on the left, and figuring out how to say no, for example. So there are a whole bunch of them, and they all fall into these 4 categories here, one of these 4 categories. Okay, phone coaching is one of the more demanding components of DBT because it requires a lot of energy and investment by the practitioner. It involves being available for clients for phone calls outside of session. A skills coaching call will typically be about 10 to 20 minutes, and it will start off very frequent and then should theoretically decrease with time. The purpose of the phone coaching is to reinforce the client for using skills instead of engaging in target behaviors. DBT also includes a therapist consultation team, which involves weekly consultation with other therapists that are doing DBT in order to support and maintain fidelity of treatment, discuss cases, problem solve, and so on. And then there is an individual component, an individual therapy component in addition to the groups, which is your typical weekly therapy and is a dedicated space to process what's going on in the groups to discuss any type of non-suicidal self-injury issues or suicidal thoughts. Typically, the group and individual therapist will be different people, by the way. Okay, so that's DBT. And the final one that I'll go over is trauma-focused CBT, which is a structured individual and parent trauma-focused model. It includes skills-based components, followed by more trauma-specific components with gradual exposure integrated into each component. Optimally, it's provided to children and parents and caregivers in parallel individual sessions with additional conjoint child-parent sessions included later in treatment. So basically what that means is you're having sessions with the child and you're having sessions with the parent, and then later you're having sessions with them together. But it also works for children exposed to a variety of traumas, multiple traumas, both genders and various ethnic racial backgrounds, and it can be applied with just the child if necessary. It can also be applied in a variety of settings: community mental health centers, foster care, DV shelters, and so on. The goals of TF-CBT are to address and re-regulate the child's trauma responses in the following domains: affect, so anxiety, sadness, anger, and affective dysregulation; behavior, any types of avoidance, self-injury, or behavioral dysregulation; biological responses like hypervigilance, sleep problems, and somatic issues; cognitions such as intrusive thoughts, dissociation, and rumination; and then finally social or school functioning, so impaired relationships, difficulty concentrating, and so on. Okay, so let's look at the specific components. The actual components of TF-CBT are listed using an acronym for ease, and they're fairly self-explanatory. So the acronym is PRACTICE with 2 P's at the beginning. Also, remember that in your crisis and trauma course, you'll be able to get trained in TF-CBT more formally. So think of this as an introduction. So the skills-based components are on the left here. The first is psychoeducation, which is basically providing information about trauma and normalizing trauma reactions. Then is parenting, where you're teaching the parent skills like behavioral management. Next is relaxation skills, and these are taught to the client to regulate physiological reactions to trauma, like panic attacks, headaches, and so on, and also taught to the parent to help them to be able to engage in these skills when they maybe are feeling triggered or when their child is struggling. Affect modulation skills involve managing affective or emotional reactions to trauma. And then cognitive coping skills involve teaching the client and parent to understand the connections between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, so CBT. The trauma-based components begin with the trauma narrative and processing, which involve correcting cognitive distortions related to trauma. The in vivo mastery is optional, not always going to be appropriate to engage in, but involves mastery of trauma reminders by gradual exposure to those reminders. Then there are the conjoint child-parent sessions and enhancing safety and future development. These components are provided in sequential order for the most part, and I'll go into a bit more depth next. All right, so these components are provided at different points in the stages of therapy. So for typical cases, the duration of treatment is about 12 to 15 sessions. You're going to begin with the stabilization phase, which is 4 to 12 sessions. This is where you're providing that psychoeducation about trauma responses, normalizing them, beginning to identify potential trauma reminders, and then you're going to introduce all of those different skills. So you'll introduce the parenting skills to help parents respond to child's dysregulation. You'll introduce the relaxation skills so that they have tools to use when triggered. You'll identify and practice affective modulation strategies to help the child become comfortable with expressing emotions. And you'll help the child recognize connections between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in order to replace maladaptive cognitions. Once that has been established, the skills have been learned and are being implemented well, you'll move on to the trauma narrative and processing phase. It's important not to move here until you have stabilized. If you start going into the trauma before you've taught the child and the parent regulation skills and affective modulation, you're setting them up to be re-traumatized and to really struggle. Okay, so do stabilization first. Then you go to trauma narrative and processing, which is about 2 to 6 sessions. And here you're supporting the child in their retelling of the trauma narrative. And during that process, you're processing maladaptive cognitions that will arise during this time. They're also going to be developing a written summary as a book format, a poem format, or a song format, where they can lay out their trauma story. You'll also have your parallel sessions with parents at this time to share the content of the child's narrative with them separately. Finally, there will be conjoint sessions when the child shares the narrative directly with their parent. In the next and final phase, the integration and consolidation phase, which is about 2 to 8 sessions, this may be where in vivo mastery will occur, where the child receives actual exposure to the situation, such as sleeping in one's own bed in the case of a child who was sexually abused in their bedroom. This final stage will involve developing strategies for enhancing safety and the child's internal sense of security and trust. And they'll also learn other skills with a focus on relapse prevention that they can learn and practice in session to help them be successful once therapy ends. Okay. All right, so very brief overview of 4 different evidence-based programs so that when you see them in your own research, you'll have an idea of what they are. You may also select one of these as a treatment approach for your paper if you have enough evidence supporting that, and you can use the information that you got here and seek out other information in the research databases to support your argument. All right, so that's all for this one. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for listening.